Well, good morning, everyone. Rodney Petersen, as you see up here, I'm now at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. My permanent position there that I've been doing for about 9 years is the director of NIST, which is a cybersecurity education and workforce program. I'm also, as you see from the slide here, the interim chief of the Applied Cybersecurity Division, which includes all of the research portfolio for cybersecurity at NIST, from post-quantum cryptography to identity management and a variety of other areas that you can imagine. I promise not to reminisce too much with this group, but for those of you who I haven't met or you who've not seen me before, I was part of this event when it first started. The first couple of years was actually the PI for it when I worked at EDUCAUSE, where I worked for 12 years, and it's really an honor to come back here and be with you here in Pittsburgh. And the announcement about being in Boulder is kind of enticing because NIST has a campus in Boulder as well, so may even come back and join you next year, maybe on the same topic. But what I wanted to share with you a little bit today is to talk about some recent developments in the federal government that I expect most of you have already by now heard about, related to research security. One other little side note is that over the past couple of years, I also spent a little bit of time helping the CHIPS Research and Development Office stand up its workforce program. And through the process of working with the CHIPS program office, I learned a lot about this topic of research security. And whenever I hear the word security, I immediately think cybersecurity and the kind of work that we all do. But no, research security is much broader than that. And so as you'll see here from just a screenshot of this memo that came out in July from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, they set forth some guidelines and expectations for what they call covered entities, which I expect are probably many of you, but in organizations that receive in excess of $50 million in federal funding for research security. And research security includes things like foreign travel, training on research security, export control, but also cybersecurity. And I'm going to mostly talk to you about the cybersecurity portions of that memo today. But I do want to just put it in context to remind you that the reason research security is such an important topic is that all of you and any of us who've worked in universities operate in environments where, faculty and researchers are conducting research primarily for the purpose of publication and sharing. We often don't even worry about the intellectual property, copyright, trademark, patent aspects of our work, although sometimes we do. And yet, we're in an increasingly adversarial environment, and a lot has changed in the past several years with respect to our foreign adversaries and competitors. So research security is really coming up in that context of not trying to, impact academic freedom and the ability to have kind of open and collaborative environments, but how can we make sure that we, don't give our foreign adversaries a step up, particularly when you're doing research that might have connections to national security issues. So putting some of those broader research security issues aside, you'll see here from the memo, it specifically talked about an expectation that institutions of higher education or other entities will implement a cybersecurity program consistent with the cybersecurity resource that NIST publishes. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but recognize this July memo came out after a draft publication that NIST produced in August. We have not produced the final version of that publication, so happy to engage with you in some questions and discussions perhaps about that later. But just to back up a little bit into why NIST got involved and why cybersecurity became an issue, again, that same CHIPS and Science Act had requirements and directed NIST to do some research and provide some resources available to institutions that are these covered entities, but specifically research institutions to help reduce cybersecurity risks. And the statutes talked about these things being generally applicable, usable, recognizing there's varying sizes, types, and sensitivities of information that's developed and shared, just promoting awareness of basic cybersecurity practices, possibly including case studies, example scenarios, and that it be outcomes-based, something that can be measured, and then, of course, be based on international technical standards, of which NIST is well known for developing. So in the context of this CHIPS and Science Act requirement, some researchers who didn't include me. I certainly advised them, but I actually now supervise them, begun to do some outreach, did an initial request for comment, held a lot of one-on-one meetings. I know they held meetings, I believe, with Trusted CI and other organizations, including EDUCAUSE and Internet2, and then held some virtual group discussions as well, leading up to this publication that I talked about, which I'm not a big fan of all the NIST numbers. I can't even keep them track myself, but if you want to go look for NIST informational resource, NIST IR 8481, you'll find that draft publication from last August. As I said earlier, there's a little more detail about the direct engagements, and, we can share these slides with you later, but wanted to let you know that we went through a normal process. But one thing I would just add quickly that I love about working at NIST is that we're very consultative. Even though we have smart people that work at NIST, a lot of them don't have the context like working in a higher education institution, which is why I came in kind of to help consult and advise them or put them in touch with smart people like some of you in the room as they began their research. But they always have workshops or draft documents to try to get the public input. So it's not just based on the government knows best, but it's based upon some kind of straw proposals that can be fine-tuned over time. So some of the key questions that were asked just during that process was, what are your common cybersecurity challenges and risks? What might be unique challenges and risks? And I know this is probably a little bit of a controversial term, unique, because quite often we have more in common than we have different. But I think the context is always important. Certainly, how do NIST resources, and if you're not aware, there are a lot of NIST publications and resources from our risk management framework, our cybersecurity framework, our privacy framework, and even NIST has a framework to talk about workforce. I was recently in a presentation where somebody was talking about WTF, and I think we all know what WTF means normally, but it was what the framework, because we have lots of them, right? So WTF, lots of framework. And you have resources in your community as well. And of course, the question of, do we need new resources that will need to be developed, not only to help perhaps those of you in the room, but your VPs of research, your sponsored research program offices, your deans and chairs and others who oversee the research enterprise. So some of the feedback that we received, and this is mostly captured in the report, is something that, all of which will be no surprise to you because a lot of this feedback came from you, but the ongoing lack of awareness. I spent yesterday with presidents from 450 colleges and universities that are part of the National Centers of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity. We convene the faculty from those 450 institutions annually, and we met on Monday, Tuesday, and then yesterday presidents and provosts came in. And as I was talking to a lot of them informally at lunch, breakfast, coffee break, it's just a reminder that cybersecurity is not their discipline, right? Cybersecurity is not what they know. That's why they hire CISOs and CIOs and others to do the work. And they turn over pretty regularly as well, institutional leadership. So just that ongoing awareness challenge. Workforce, which is certainly something important to the work I do at NICE, is recognition of not only do we need the skilled cybersecurity workforce to secure enterprises, but we also have the challenge of retaining people and the turnover there, and exactly how does our NICE framework perhaps help reinforce the work that happens in this area. And then the culture clash, which comes from kind of the research mission, versus the mission, the business mission, or even the academic mission of an institution. By the way, it's another thing I appreciate about working at NIST. I tell people that NIST is really a research institution without students. And that's a little bit of a misnomer because we have postdocs and we certainly have interns throughout the year. But we have the same challenges that you all have. We're running experimentation and doing research in ways that shows that clash with what the business system or business side of the house wants to do. Need to say nothing about limited cybersecurity budgets. We hear that all the time. The complicated requirements landscape is something I just want to kind of foot stomp a little bit, because I think we heard this a lot, and not only some of you may be a public institution, you have state requirements, you may be part of a system of universities and you have system requirements, and then of course you have increasingly federal requirements, and not just a single federal requirement. You've got HIPAA requirements, you've got Cram-Leach-Bliley, you've got red flags rules, and on and on and on, and then throw what NIST might do on top of this. By the way, I should add here something really important is that NIST is very proud to say we're a non-regulatory agency. And the guidance and the frameworks and the research we put out On the one hand, FISMA requires us to do certain things for the federal government, and they must adhere to it. But anything that the private sector, academia, research organizations use is kind of your choice, and it's meant to be guidance. It's meant to be voluntary. Our cybersecurity framework being a classic example of that. So I'll often hear in the radio, driving in the work about, this helps you meet NIST compliance requirements. Well, NIST doesn't have compliance requirements, at least with respect to these topics. But again, the memo might change that a little bit. And then, of course, the rapid pace of innovation that you're all seeing with critical and emerging technologies. Also, some recognition that it's not a one-size-fits-all, even within academic disciplines, that different research areas based on interinstitutional efforts or, the requirements from the funding agencies, each of these areas have kind of unique challenges and risks. So, just kind of continuing on to a little bit of where we saw some of the recommendations heading is whether or not we should develop more targeted cybersecurity resources for research institutions, particularly the covered entities. What kind of collaborative engagements do we need? I'll be real honest with you that, and this is from a person who came from higher education, which, by the way, I worked at the University of Maryland for 12 years before working at EDUCAUSE, and then now at the government. Whenever the government comes and thinks they have all the answers, they don't. You all know that, and so we really have to rely on collaboration and subject matter experts. Training not only for the awareness part that I talked about earlier for executives, but training, for cybersecurity practitioners or for researchers or for data handlers or for all of those that support the process. It's really important that we provide that kind of professional development. And then, as I said earlier, we have lots of frameworks. In fact, one of the things in my interim role I'm working really hard is trying to align and harmonize those frameworks so that, and by the way, I should add, we now have an AI risk management framework and a secure software development framework. So as we develop these different frameworks, you can begin to see how they fit together. And then finally, just skipping over the other one, is just shared services, which is something I know, even through organizations like the REN-ISAC or other places where you can, work together to maximize your resources. So just kind of concluding with some next steps, and this was in the report and things because, as I indicated, it was a draft we haven't necessarily taken action on, but whether or not there should be community-specific cybersecurity resources. And I lay that out to you today as a question. In a moment, we'll take questions from you or comments from you, and I'd love to hear your input on that. Just one small example is if you're tracking the latest NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, we have begun building what we call profiles, which are usually organizational profiles or maybe sector profiles. And there's been some consideration, do we need a cybersecurity profile for research institutions, which is something we're open to developing, obviously, in collaboration with you. What kind of ongoing collaboration do we need both with covered entities, but more importantly across the government, because this memo is really directing a variety of federal agencies to place these requirements or expectations on covered entities, and we have to be consistent and coordinate with each other, and now we're part of those interagency conversations as well. And then finally, of course, is the capacity building. It's one thing to place requirements or new expectations upon organizations, but how do we continue to make sure that they have the ability to follow through on them? So as I said, we have a lot of existing resources. They're documented in the publication, from the things that NIST produces, the things that you as a community produce, the things that EDUCAUSE, the Trusted CI, and others have produced as well, and those are documented there. Mike's going to talk a little bit more, I think, about one of these in particular, some of the security controls that are produced in our 800-53 publication, to throw out another number there. But there are a lot of other resources. I should just kind of conclude about our resources by indicating the fundamental thing that NIST believes in is risk-based planning for cybersecurity. And so all of this starts with our risk management framework, and even our cybersecurity framework takes a risk-based approach. Our NIST framework on workforce is recognizing that people are part of the risk as well, and we need a knowledgeable and skilled workforce to reduce our enterprise risk. So everything we do and everything we expect you to do to be in compliance with this starts with how are we minimizing the risk, and how are we as institutions or organizations making sure our leadership are calculating cybersecurity or research security into institutional risk. So there is an email address where you can send more contact questions or comments as well, but as I said, in a few moments, we'll take some from you as well. So Mike, why don't you come on up and do his presentation. Do I need to skip, or is it just after mine? She'll pull it up.
You'll pull it up.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Rodney. All right, thank you. Oh, it's not a problem.
Where's my mic? Here we are. Which one are you?
No.
This is what I have.
No.
Nope.
Oh, there it is.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And present. There we go. Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much. Rodney was great. And I got to tell you, one of the things that I've really enjoyed working at NSF is I now get to work with Rodney again. Because Rodney and I go back quite a ways from his EDUCAUSE days. So what I want to do is talk just a little bit about what this means from the NSF perspective. And then I'll also give you just a couple of slides about the secure centers you've probably heard about that NSF awarded in July. So there's a lot to be said about this. Many of you probably remember when NSPM 33 first came out. It was followed up by the original OSTP implementation memo, and it listed a bunch of security controls. And many of us have been sitting around worrying about, well, what's going to happen to those controls? What are the controls going to be? What does this really mean for cybersecurity? They've disappeared. And now the reference is really just a reference back to the work that NIST has been doing. The critical thing, though, I think for us is we are in a role in the federal government of helping coordinate what is it going to mean to certify your research security programs. In fact, I was just on a call about this yesterday. And what ended up happening through this whole sort of transition through the various versions of the OSTP memo is now the 8481 is explicitly called out as what, and NIST guidance is called out as what you're going to have to comply with. Now, the one thing I do want to mention, and Rodney talked about this a little bit, when you think about research security programs, all of us, again, translate that to cybersecurity. But the reality is cybersecurity is a very small component of research security programs. Most of the activity and most of the concern is foreign influence, conflict of interest, disclosures. And if you look at the NSF website that deals with this, the Office of the Chief Officer for Security Services and Policy, I think is what it is. The acronyms get lost on me. You'll see there's nothing up there about cybersecurity at this point in time. And the meeting we had yesterday to talk about this dealt with the fact that we're putting together right now a interagency task force that's going to be looking at how do we certify these programs. And the question we were discussing yesterday is how do we certify the cybersecurity component? You know, what guidance do we give people? When I talk to people that are, say, in VCR or VPR roles, their question is, what is it we need to do? And they're very nervous about that. On one hand, and I've been on both sides of this equation, it's very nice to say, do what you think is best and tell us what you're doing. But the leadership really wants black and white answers because they're very afraid once they certify, they're liable and can be held accountable for something that was kind of weak. So part of our challenge is, even though it is it provides maximum flexibility, and as Rodney will tell you, NIST doesn't want to be prescriptive about this. That isn't their role. But 8481 really doesn't provide black and white guidance on what we're supposed to do. It provides a lot of guidance on what NIST may develop in the future. And so I think it'll be very important when I shut up that we hear from you as to what would be the most helpful to you. Because the one critique I would say I have personally about 8481 is everything that people said about this is a challenge for us in a research program. It's true for major institutions writ large. Budgets are short. There's too many regulations. You know, all of these problems exist for all of us in every context, not just the research program. So the natural question you're having is then, okay, if I'm not getting a black and white standard to adhere to for my research security program cybersecurity component, what is a reasonable next step to do? And now the first one is decide whether or not you're a covered entity. You're almost all going to be covered entities, is my guess. We have decided that, let's see, I think it's my next one. Major facilities will be covered entities. There might be a little wiggle room in some of these as this works out. And mid-scales are almost all at major universities or smaller universities. And those universities get more than $50 million a year in federal funding. They're going to be covered entities. Now, the other thing to be very aware of, though, in this context, when you engage with your Vice Chancellor for Research, your sponsored programs office, those folks, is that the certification will be coming from the institution for the institution, not for one particular or just your research programs. And so this is going to be very tricky to figure out how do we do this. And I know, having been a CISO, I could tell the cyber insurers, we do all these things, where we means the enterprise and maybe the researchers. And so now with this coming as a research security program, even though it's covering your whole institution, there's going to be a lot of questions about, are you actually doing any of this in the research programs, these controls? Obviously, keep an eye forward. NIST is going to finalize this document at some time, and as Rodney said, there's going to be a fair amount of work coming out of it, which will be helpful. The other things, though, that I would really consider doing is if you're describing your program or building a program, point to, rely on, reference NIST work. NIST is the government standard for this kind of guidance, and many of you are using other frameworks and other control sets. That's fine, but make sure you can always crosswalk between them, because when the government comes asking about these things, they'll probably ask for it in their language, which is NIST. The other thing I would suggest, and this is, again, maybe this is a little self-serving, but I work at NSF, so if you're running a research program and you're wondering about how to do this, pay very close attention to the guidance that's coming out in the forthcoming RIG a little later. Well, actually, it'll probably be the first part of 2025. It gets published by OMB sometime in the next 2 months for public comment, I believe, in the Research Infrastructure Guide. Because the Research Infrastructure Guide is where we're telling major facilities and mid-scale projects what they need to document and how to document what they should be doing to, when NSF comes and asks, what are you doing about cybersecurity? So it's really straightforward, and I'll talk about these just a tiny bit later on. I've included some material from the RIG just for reference because you all have access to the slides. Document your information management program, which, as I've said before, is really just a description of every element of your cybersecurity program. Identify the framework explicitly. Say what your framework is. It's amazing how often, and I'm as guilty as this as anyone, someone says, which framework do you use? Well, I use a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. I kind of wing it. Write it down, pick one, live with it. It would be my recommendation. Same thing with a control set. Whatever your control set is, keep that mapping the NIST. And almost all the major control sets map to one another one way or the other. It's not that hard to find this kind of stuff. I would make sure that you're paying close attention to your basic cyber hygiene controls and you get them implemented. I've identified 14 in the RIG that we are not requiring, but we're asking about very aggressively. And just to remind you, we didn't just make up these 14 out of the blue. We looked at the major incidents that have taken place at NSF facilities as far back as we had documentation, and we identified what are the practices that people implement after a major incident, and that's how we came up with this 14. Again, there's no control requirements right now in the response to NSPM 33 and the OSTP memos, but there could be in the future. So keep that in mind. And then make sure that you've got your cyber risks identified on your organizational risk register. If you're a university, you should have a university risk register. Most of you do. But are you talking to the office that manages it and getting cyber risks on there? That's really critical. It's actually, I've been on these kinds of committees. It's also very illuminating for you because your world is cyber risk. And then you're sitting in a room full of people that are worrying about student drinking and things like this. And it really changes your perspective quite a bit. And of course, have a security budget line item. Now, I want to save time for questions, so I'll just say, oh, by the way, here's the link. This is the page on the NSF website where the current and any drafts of the rig are listed. Right now, it doesn't have the cybersecurity section on there, but I'm sure it'll show up before too long. And again, the slides are available. I'm not going to give you this read this eye chart with you. I include it just for reference. This is just cut and paste from the rig. These are the components of the Information Assurance Management Plan. And you can see it's the basic stuff. How do you govern yourself? Where do you document your control sets in your framework? What are your functions? You know, who does what, where, when, and how? This should be a 12 to 20 page document for a major institution or a big program that your boss can read at lunch and knows what the heck you're doing for cybersecurity. Having this kind of thing in one place can be a pain if you have nothing like it right now, but once it's done, it's shockingly useful when you're dealing with management. And then I've also included, again, I don't want to talk about this at length, but here are the controls that we're asking about at NSF of the major facilities. And many of you at major facilities, you all got a survey last year. We'll do it again in a couple of months about what's your status on these controls. And again, these are the things that we found were implemented after major incidents. So we're very excited to see there's a lot of progress getting done on these right now. So thank you if you're working on that. And then I do want to say I'll say just a few words because I'm not an expert on it, but we were asked about it. As part of the research program infrastructure, NSF did a solicitation for what we call the secure centers. And you can go, I'll give you in a second here the links. We ended up, instead of giving one award, these were ISAOs. They were supposed to be information sharing and analysis organizations related to research security. Now, you're probably all saying, wait a second, Mike, every 5 security professionals starts their own information sharing organization. There's a lot of them. Why do we need another one? Go back to what I said earlier. The research security program efforts are not really aimed at cybersecurity. They're primarily aimed at everything else around it. So here are the 2 awards that were made. In the end, they decided to, I was not part of this whole process, I was watching it, to divide it. Instead of 1 major award, it was 2 large awards. One at the University of Washington, who's doing the Secure Center, one at Texas A&M that's doing the secure analytics component of it. And here's a sort of a description of it. One is dealing with identifying risks, analyzing risks, in some way I view the Secure Center, and hopefully I'm not wrong about this, as a research security version of this conference. Bring people together, talk about the problems, identify solutions, et cetera. And then the secure analytics is collecting information and data about all this and analyzing it and doing some reporting on it. If you have questions on it, you're welcome to come up and ask me about it later. I won't be able to answer them. But what I can do is, what I did do is I included the program officer for each one there. So you can either go just read the awards yourself. If you know someone at the institution, you can contact them. Or you can contact either Shauna or Steve, and they can answer questions and talk with you about it. This is just a nice picture that was provided. And then I've got some resources, just convenient links to make the slides more useful to you. So that's all I have to say. So I guess we have 15 minutes for questions.
Is there a handheld mic there?
Oh, there is.
So, yep, Rodney, come up.
Here you go, sir. You want to come up?
Yep, we'll get one right now.
If you have any questions.
Yeah, we got one over here.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm currently from EarthScope. where we manage two major facilities right now. And I've been very interested in seeing us really nail down our cybersecurity program. One of the struggles we've had is that cybersecurity and authentication and factors like that for an open science facility has largely been an unfunded request or unfunded mandate. Do you see the NSF applying more intentional funding capacity to institutions so that they can actually budget these things in with money set aside for it?
I think there's two answers for that. The answer is to the best of our abilities. The reality is if NSF requires you to paint the walls blue, we have to pay for blue paint. It's kind of how it works. And it's very easy for an outsider to look at a facility and say, you get $50 million a year. What do you mean you can't afford a security engineer? That's both right and wrong, because it's like your condo, your homeowners association comes to you and makes you redesign something. It doesn't seem fair at the same time. There's no funding for it. So I do know that in renewals, many facilities are now starting to add more cybersecurity to the renewals. I'm not in the sort of cash loop, so I have no idea how well that is received. It probably depends a lot on the particular division you're in. You guys are in the earth sciences. And it also depends on the ebb and flow of the NSF budget. I do know that I have been advocating internal to NSF that we need to make some targeted investments in cybersecurity. Now, I work in the major and mid-scale swim lane. Once you get into grants, that sort of next level, it explodes in scale. So I've been making those arguments, and they've been falling on receptive ears, but I would probably have to gut a chicken to tell you the odds of how this is going to work out in the long term. But yes, we're trying. Something else?
Yes, thank you for the talk. I'm Phương Cao from University of Illinois. Can you talk about the post-quantum effort that NIST has been leading?
A little. So two aspects of it. Post-quantum encryption is obviously the most kind of critical and emergent concern. And so a few weeks ago, we came out with new proposed algorithms, and we've had an ongoing process of competitions and trying to identify what we think are going to be the best algorithms to protect against quantum computing in the future. So look for those, but also know that's not the end story, right? We're going to continue to evolve and develop and improve those algorithms. More importantly, one of the organizations under my purview is called the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and it provides applied cybersecurity research in partnership with industry as well as other government entities and academia. And so we have a program on transition to post-quantum cryptography. So whether you're an institution, an organization, or a business or a government entity who needs to figure out how do we make that transition to post-quantum cryptography, we have more practical guidance and workshops and training and materials available to help organizations with that. So obviously a very high priority topic for us.
The one other comment I'll make along those lines, for those of you that are in security leadership positions, thinking about quantum and what you folks are doing may feel like it's such deep infrastructure that it's out of your control and out of your concern. The reality is that you should be putting some cycles today into what this is going to look like in 5 years for you. At least be tracking it closely. I do worry that these big shifts like quantum are going to blindside us when they finally get here. We're not going to have been prepared for them.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sam Chan from GMTO. On the risk register, is the NSF or NIST going to have the risk formalized risk register to pass out? That way we can have the same weighting, like backup maybe on the risk register, or ransomware is on your risk register, we put the same weight on it so that, one doesn't put it at the bottom, one doesn't put it at the top.
Well, I think that risk registers are intrinsically local. I mean, yes, everyone has got some exposure to ransomware, and that's a big risk, but you may have a very mature ransomware program, which minimizes that risk. And so when it comes to the risk registers, those are locally controlled, locally weighted, locally evaluated.
Let me just add one more thing to the question, because I agree with Mike, but from a critical infrastructure perspective, the government, especially the Department of Homeland Security, but others have been working across sectors to try to not only share, but to rationalize risk assessment. And I know that's happening for energy, so any of you that are part of the energy sector, that may already be occurring, and you may be sharing that information. Where there's still a gap, some 15 years later after I left EDUCAUSE and we started the Higher Education Information Security Council, how does this apply to education and higher education? The Department of Education and CISA recently have started partnering to provide more resources and more leadership, more coordination to K-12 schools for some of the obvious reasons you all know. They're under-resourced, they have been subject to ransomware attacks, they don't have typically the capabilities or the staff, the personnel to do this. Higher education, though, I recently attended the meeting where we were sharing kind of risk assessments across the sectors, is not quite as organized because they kind of divide us in a couple of ways. Back to the physical security, if you have stadiums, arenas, concerts, sporting events, et cetera, that's one risk area that they're very much concerned about and collecting risk data about. The cybersecurity IT side of higher education, not so much. So anyway, I know some of you may be outside of that higher education system, but I think this notion of sharing across a sector is something that is continuing to evolve and improve.
Good morning. Thanks for the presentation. Anurag Shankar from Indiana University. So, you asked for feedback, Rodney, and I've provided this feedback through the 8481 process and all that sort of stuff. When I saw those list of cybersecurity requirements in the OSTP guidance, last year was extremely concerning because not only didn't it, specify scope and things like that, it was just problematic, I think, across the board. And then so it was nice to see that disappeared from the final guidance, but now the buck has been passed to NIST. And I think the idea of specifying a control set for research is just fundamentally problematic, because I've been helping researchers secure their workflows for 20 years, especially in clinical research and all that stuff. And each case is unique, and the risk that it represents is unique, and therefore a risk-based approach sort of broadly is the one that actually works. But when you have a monolithic control set like 15 controls, that makes very little sense. Maybe 2 or 3 of those controls are pretty pedestrian, so they should be in place. So I think this is something that should be recognized, that specifying some sort of a control set makes almost no sense. And that's a feedback that should be strongly considered.
Yeah, and with that comment, I wanted to reread. I had this on a slide, but for the cybersecurity parts of the memo, institutions of higher education will certify that they will implement a cybersecurity program consistent with the NIST resources. And you kind of heard me say, as you just said, what the resources are, and they're risk-based as well. This takes me back, quite frankly, to this group in its early days where NSF wanted you all to improve and increase cybersecurity for your research facilities, and there was some debate and discussion about how far do we go. And I was involved at that time with some partners from NSF to essentially develop a pretty flexible statement as well. And the context, I alluded to this earlier, in 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was fairly new, and everybody was like, oh, does this apply to us? The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act said that you implement an information security program with administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. Pretty open-ended and flexible. And I don't think there's a lot different from what we're saying here today. We're not saying do nothing. We're saying do something and use the resources that are available from the government, from your community, to document that you're doing something. And I think the question of how you certify and how we as federal agencies decide that you've met our expectation is still being worked out a little bit. But I think it's our expectation if you put forward the program you developed for your institution, it's risk-based, and it has institutional leadership buy-in, you've certified compliance with us.
Because I agree with what Rodney said completely. The challenge I see, and I think I've talked about this before with other groups, is when things go wrong, the administration, other agencies, they hone in on specific controls, these very basic controls, and they go, what do you mean this wasn't in place? And so I think we have to figure out how to balance that so that we've got the right story to tell when these things happen, or else it can blow up on us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Muhammad Khairi. I'm from Jabris Christian University. My question is related to researchers' collaboration. I want to know what, if you can tell me more about the NIST, how they facilitate this collaboration between researchers.
Collaboration between who specifically?
Researchers, cybersecurity researchers who work in research industry.
Oh, between researchers and the cybersecurity professionals. Yes. Well, I can only speak here really for personal experience, is that it's always been a big challenge for me, because as a cybersecurity professional, my team is worried about operational security at an institution. And how many times? Dozens. I've had a researcher come in and said, I developed something, put it in your data center. And that never really worked because scope, scale, production expectations made it very challenging to do. Some of the best collaboration I had, though, was at my last job, where we literally hired a postdoc and a graduate student of one of the campus researchers, VIP security researcher, into the office. And we shared the cost of that person. And getting that integration between operations and the research lab, where they saw what we did and they learned from what we did, was invaluable and produced some really excellent work that turned into publications. So just on a personal note, that kind of embedding of researchers in the operational offices went a long way. I don't know if that helps or not.
And just quickly, at NIST, we already require the security research training that OSTP is expecting others to do as well. And we have an Office of Academic and International Affairs, so they kind of blend the work we do, partnership with academia, with the international connections and the risk landscape, quite frankly. I have found those training sessions in and of themselves to provide that kind of collaborative environment, because not only do they in the training provide examples of emails, and trust you, I receive them monthly from foreign entities wanting to connect, collaborate, get information from me. But others in the room do as well. They have stories, they have anecdotes, experiences from foreign travel, which, as I said, is another part of this memo. So that's just one other way that get your researchers thinking about not just the subject matter expertise research they conduct, but the research process and some of the, opportunities and risks. I would add, obviously the latest topic with this is artificial intelligence and what's the impact of artificial intelligence on safety, security, reliability, et cetera. So lots of opportunities for both training and collaboration. Is there another question over here? Yes.
Hi, Randy Trudeau from LIGO Caltech. This is great guidance, and I really appreciate it. It really helps us start looking forward about what we're going to need to do and to shore up our cybersecurity programs. But the one thing I didn't see on there, and I think a lot of us talk about this, is cyber insurance and whether the NSF or the government at some point is going to require us to purchase private cyber insurance.
If there is, I'm unaware of it. I know at NSF there's, in fact, in the RIG, there's actually a statement that NSF takes no position on whether you have cyber insurance or not as a managing organization. I will reiterate what most of you probably know. You can't use federal funds, though, to pay a ransom. And the nuance to that is that it appears that you can't use federal funds to pay somebody else to pay your ransom. So that component of cyber insurance that pays the ransom, it appears that you can't use federal money to pay for that component of it. I'm not sure how you would carve that out in a policy, but that's the discussion that's going on. And Right now, I've been working with our general counsel to clarify the language and terms and conditions around this. Thanks, Randy.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time coming here today and answering our questions. Everyone, let's please give a round of applause to Michael and Rodney.